Hello, everyone. Welcome to the H+ Academy Roundtable discussion and debate. Our topic is AI, the GPT-4, the open letter, and some of the issues, the consequences of what's going on not only in social media, but in the mainstream media, the concerns people have, and whether we can shine a clearer light on the issues with the experts here today. We have Robin Hanson, Peter Voss, Max Moore, Anders Sandberg, Mark Miller, and Ben Gertzwell. I've divided this session up into 4 areas, and Anders did make a suggestion for one of the areas, which we will certainly acknowledge. And please feel free, everyone, to jump in, even if you're not in the specific group for the area of discussion, if you have something to say, or at least put it in the chat so everyone can see it there. The reason I've divided this up into 4 separate sessions is because this is a very heady area. It's got so much information, and we really wanted to fine-tune this specific meeting's direction on them. The first area, we're going to have Max Moore, Robin Hanson, and Anders Sandberg discussing. Max, why don't you introduce the area and some of your thoughts on it, and then we'll go to Robin, then Anders.
Yeah, I'll be pretty brief on this. I think it's just a matter of trying to separate out the groups a little bit. And this is a fairly crude grouping of 3, and I'm sure we can divide these up further. John Stokes, some of you probably know John Stokes' blogs. He's written a very detailed kind of anthropological account of the different sides here with many different groupings, but this is kind of a simplified version. I think it's useful to try and divide them up, and again, we can divide these further in that probably the doomers is obviously a very broad label. It includes everybody from Eliezer, who thinks we're absolutely completely screwed, to people who think we just maybe 35% chance. I think that's a very different group in general from the people focused on the short-term worries about increased spam and these kind of issues, and they tend to be stereotypically kind of left in politics in general, not universally, but generally. And then obviously another wide grouping of accelerationists, and some of you might object to that term. I'll adopt it proudly because I do want to accelerate things, to the horror of the doomers, because you could be someone who just wants decent progress and not necessarily accelerating it. My concern is, as we'll probably talk about, without AI, we may all be dead fairly soon of old age, and so I actually do want things to accelerate because I don't think we've really gotten very far at this stage. So, any comments on these categories? And the idea really is, if we want to focus on solutions and guardrails, we need to know what kind of time frame we're talking about, what kind of problems we're talking about, because there's a lot of crosstalk between the short-term worry people and the existential risk people, and they're really quite different concerns, I think.
Max, I think there seems to be, in my mind, another difference, and that is a lot of people, when they talk about AI risk, they talk about, misinformation, and, I think that's maybe the category you consider left of sort of the negative impact it has on society, rather than being an existential risk. But I think then, on the doomers, would you also include people who say there's a non-negligible risk of it killing us all, but unlike Eliezer, and say, any risk or a 2% risk is too big. So I think that the doomers, would you include people who think there's a small risk that it might wipe us out?
Yeah, because there's no real right answer. It's just a matter of how we want to define those. I guess I could call those optimistic doomers or cheerful doomers. They do think there's a chance of doom, but it's a pretty small one. So I think as long as we define what we mean, it is a very broad grouping. So if someone thinks there's a 0.001% chance of destruction, we call them a doom. Obviously, don't want to confuse those with people giving a 99% chance.
Let's go to Robin. Robin, what do you think about these 3 categories? And do you see any concerns or issues that we should address now? I think we froze. Robin? Robin's froze. Let's go to Anders. Go ahead, Anders.
Okay. Yeah. So I think one can and should subdivide the groups and try to figure out where they're coming from. We already talked about the doomers with high and low probability. And I think we will get later into details about why they think they do. And a lot of their actions are going to be dependent on their theory of value. The same thing is also true for the perhaps slightly badly named left short-term warriors. So it certainly exists a community of people working on AI ethics and being very concerned about algorithmic bias, the spam, and fake news, and various concentrations of power. These, well, traditionally, at least in academia, you tend to get left-leaning academics being very happy to deal with that. And they quite often do think that being concerned about superintelligence and existential risk distracts us from the real important topics, to the horror, of course, of the people who think X risk is actually a really important thing. It doesn't matter if we get nice equality if we also end up being dead. And to this group, that's a weird consideration, because they generally tend to assume that AI and technology embodies human societal biases. And that is an important topic, but they can't bring themselves to think that the technology can also change the world and how society works without human decisions and intentions. They're kind of not buying the Hayekian, then there are some things that emerge through human action, but not human intention. So there is, I think, an unnecessary conflict here, which is quite stupid, to be honest. It's also worth noticing that there is another related group, and they are actually pro-technology and not necessarily leftists, who think that AI is a bit overhyped. It's unlikely to change things too much. We should actually not be too worried about that doom thing. There's many other problems. So to conclude, I have a link I'm putting in the chat, which is from the AI Objectives Institute. So this institute, which I'm part of, we did a little bit of a survey where we looked at the Twitter discourse and tried to use language model to cluster the discourse. And you end up with a different set of groups, which somewhat overlap with these ones, but also have slightly different ways of taking it. So I think it's important to recognize that you can slice the discourse in different ways. And sometimes you belong to one group, and then sometimes you end up in another group with some very uneasy bedfellows. But that's fine. That's how most complex discourses work.
Robin, we went to you, but you were frozen at the time, so
yeah, sorry, I just came to keep the same freezing exactly when you come to me. I want to make two short points.
Sure.
One is that one of the main dimensions of disagreement isn't so much about the chance of doom, it's about the chance of doom now, in the sense of what's the chance that completely out of proportion to what current systems do, we might be taking a chance now that would cause a doom. So many people, even myself, could be very concerned about where things will eventually go, but not very concerned at the moment that the things we're doing now have much of a chance of causing that. And I think that's one of the dimensions that people are, in this big dimensional space, as Anders indicates. You can be very concerned about what will eventually happen without necessarily thinking that if we don't shut things down now, we're taking a big risk. So the chance of doom now is different from the chance of doom. And the other issue I'd want to point out is that, we economists know a lot about regulation and about how that's worked in the world. And I think many people have this naive sense that, if you just regulate, all you're doing is maybe slowing down and cutting back, but you're not risking very much else. And we want to point out, no, regulation has a lot of other costs and risks that you have to be careful of. And in particular, I think there's a substantial chance the world is just cutting back on lots of things that once you cut back, you're just not willing to bring them back. And I worry that that's happened with nuclear energy, genetic engineering, and a lot of other things, that once there's a substantial amount of regulatory caution about something, then it just stays that way for a very long time. So that's another issue here, is if you want to do a pause or regulation or limit, is there a way to do that that doesn't risk these really big things going wrong with regulation?
I think that's a really important point. And because you made that point, and because Anders added that the gray areas of different combined groups of thinking, how it's not so binary or not so black and white, that there are crossovers. Let's go back. We've got a few more minutes in this session. Max, do you want to make a comment on either Anders or Robin?
Yeah, I think what Robin said is very important. I try to convey some of that in my own piece on this. The regulations just don't work the way people think. They think you kind of point and shoot the regulations and they do the job you want. Of course, it doesn't work out that way. And you mentioned nuclear power, which I think is a great example of that, with the ludicrous LARA guidelines, where you have to, any new improvements, they raise the standards. So every time there's any possibility of raising the standards, technically they make you do it. So economically, it never gets any cheaper. As a result, nuclear costs probably 3 or 4 times what it needs to do, and that could easily happen to AI. So I agree that's a big point. I also like the distinction between the short-term doomers and long-term doomers. That's also an important distinction, because I certainly don't see how large language models are going to murder us in our sleep in the next week or so. But yeah, it could be possible a much different AI system in the future. So yeah, I think those are important distinctions.
Go ahead, Mark. Oh, and there's just a moment. Let's let Mark jump in.
So I want to call my position, I will call it a decentralist. It starts by taking the doomers' premises quite seriously, but drawing accelerationist conclusions from it. So the doomer scenario that they're concerned about is a hard takeoff resulting in a unipolar outcome. It's a hard takeoff because once it's able to exceed human designers in designing improvements to itself, that it can improve itself and improve its ability to improve itself. This is the Foom scenario or the chain reaction, where suddenly you might get a very, very fast takeover. And it's a unipolar outcome in their fears, because once it's achieved that, it can be vastly more intelligent than us, perhaps vastly more intelligent than human civilization put together. I won't comment on the plausibility of that second part, but it is part of their scenario. And if it's then in a position to take over, then it can pursue goals and ignore our desires. And whether that's because of misconceived utility functions or whatever it is they're imagining, I think is besides the point. I think the place where they go from I think correctly identifying the danger is they then misdiagnose the nature of the danger.
I think that's an important point right there. So before you conclude that, because I think this goes into the next section, Anders and then Robin, do you want to have your closing thoughts on this particular section?
So I think one important driver of the doom view, and even sometimes of accelerationist view, but that is generally that if you're very uncertain of something, which is a key property of this debate, where everybody is too certain about what the state is, they obviously haven't studied it very carefully. That means that if something is risky and uncertain, you should be much more cautious, because the risk might be higher than expected. And if you then think that the downsides of that risk coming true are too big, then you need to be very careful. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to run into the arms of a precautionary principle. You might actually use a sensible approach and say, oh, we need to really ramp up getting relevant information here while working, etc., which is what a lot of the normal AI people who kind of rather gung-ho are saying. We're going to learn so much safety by just throwing stuff out there, and that's going to hopefully teach us enough. Conversely, if you're an accelerationist and say, well, it's 99% chance that we'll get killed, but 1% of a super mega awesome world, that might actually be a reason for acceleration, even if you're uncertain. Although most people say that's a little bit of a weird position. Most of us are tilted towards avoiding risk. But it's interesting to see that your views on risk avoidance might affect quite strongly what actions you endorse, even if the probability estimates are uncertain.
So I think the risk of the disaster scenario that they have in mind is high enough to take it seriously.
Robin, what do you think on that? I'm sorry, Mark.
But I want to make one more.
Yeah, sure.
But because they misdiagnosed the problem that of their scenario is not primarily a problem of intelligence or superintelligence. It's a problem of centralization of power. Centralized power can pursue its own goals and ignore the fact that it's stepping on people, that it's misaligned with human good. And the hard takeoff, the problem of it is the unipolar outcome. Any regulatory solution, any precautionary solution, any anti-accelerationist solution, including the 6-month pause, raises the probability of a hard takeoff and therefore a unipolar outcome. The best way to avoid their dangers, as well as serve good goals if it doesn't happen their way, but the best way to avoid their dangers is accelerationist, because we are in a greater position of ignorance now than we ever will be again at how to build intelligences. You want the soft takeoff is about spreading out the takeoff and having it be as multipolar as possible. So if we all work hard towards building intelligences in diverse ways from a position of greater ignorance than we ever will have again, we maximize the probability of this emerging in a soft and multipolar manner.
Okay, Robin, your point.
It seems to me that this topic is a worst case of all the topics I've ever seen with respect to people coming at it from a lot of different perspectives. They just have whole different sets of abstractions they bring to this. And that makes it really hard for them to engage each other. That's what I see here. And so I understand the instinct to try to make a map of the space or classify people, but I think the main thing people need here is just to have like one-on-one conversations where you try to get down and understand each other. And that's just hard. I've done that sometimes in my life where I've tried to just really understand somebody with a very different point of view, and it can take hours, but it can be worth the effort. And that's what I think needs to happen here. We just need to sort of get into details as much as we can. And that still may be hard here, but doing joint policy together is really hard in this context. In some sense, this is sort of like there's a world of people who have a sort of usual point of view, and then there's a set of which seem to the outside world as contrarians. And in this world, these contrarians have actually talked to each other more and developed a set of shared abstractions. And from that point of view, they feel like they have solid arguments and the rest of the world's neglecting them. But I don't think they quite appreciate just how different their abstractions are from the abstractions other people use elsewhere to think about these things. And that's my main high-level construct here. Is the main solution here is, I think, just get down into concrete details and go through the specifics. And I can't really see much progress from like high-level abstract categories here.
Good.
Let's
Thank you.
get into details.
Very good. Okay, so what we came out from this is to get out of the silos and not generalize too much, but look at the core problems. Our next topic here, logic of assertion in most camps, or just say less a general assertion, is that large language models resulting in AGI. And so let's focus on Peter, Ben, and Mark for this topic. And of course, Max and Robin and Anders can jump in. So why don't we start with Peter and then go to Ben and then back to Mark.
Yeah, I don't know that the consensus is that LLMs, large language models, will directly lead to AGI. In fact, I think as far as the scientists are concerned, the consensus is probably more on the other side, that they can't lead directly to AGI because they are missing some very fundamental things, which at the moment, there don't seem to be any solid proposals on how to overcome those fundamental limitations. And limitations include the lack of incremental learning, permanent learning that can be integrated into the system, the lack of reliability, just the way the model has acquired knowledge. It doesn't really have a way of validating the accuracy of it. And probably the other thing that most people point to is the lack of system 2, of metacognition, of the system being able to monitor its own sort of thought processes. Well, it doesn't have thought process, but its own performance. And so there's general skepticism that GPT, basically generative, pre-trained transformer models, all three of these letters actually mean something. They each impose severe limitations. Now, having said that, I do believe that GPT has sort of indicated there's probably a massive hardware overhang, that that the systems can perform as well as they do without a lot of optimization. I mean, if you think of the next few years of people optimizing these systems, you could get a lot more performance with a lot less computational power. But fundamentally, I think the from a theoretical point of view, it's very unlikely that the GPT architecture will get to AGI.
Excellent, thank you. Ben, your view, please.
Yeah, so I don't think that a GPT system in the technical sense of this pre-trained transformer is going to become an AGI, and I think few people think that. On the other hand, GPT has become a sort of brand name, and even GPT-4 is not a pure transformer. You've got Wolfram Alpha integrated there, and you've got a host of different specialized AI systems developed originally for Microsoft Bing being integrated on the back end of GPT. So I think actually if you look at the specific points Peter just raised, I would argue those could all be addressed by incremental improvements on GPT-4. So you could, I mean, online learning can be done within a transformer framework. That's just a matter of tweaking algorithms to make it a bit more scalable. And the sort of mainstream approach to increasing truthfulness and reliability of these models will be to do something like was done in the ERNIE model, or the differential neural computer model from DeepMind, where you co-train a knowledge graph along with a hierarchical network, and then stock knowledge about the real world into the knowledge graph. Reflection is a somewhat deeper point, but one can certainly imagine training networks to place probes into the state of a transformer, and then using the output of those probes as data to feed into the transformer. So I think there are directions, which are real research directions, for tweaking transformers to overcome the problems with the current versions like GPT-4 and Llama and so forth. I actually don't think that's how AGI is going to be achieved. Whether or not it could be possible, I don't think it's the best route, but I suspect what will happen instead is people can make cognitive architectures which have a more full-featured reflection of the pieces that go into a human-like mind, but where a large language model is one of the components of multi-component cognitive architecture. And Yoshua Bengio, one of the pioneers of deep learning, had a blog post a couple of weeks ago where he talked about coupling a large language model with another model that learns by finding minimal description length, sort of Occam's razor, trying to find simple explanations, and another reinforcement learning module. So that's a case where you have three different components, and LLM is one of them, and there's a lot more serious attempt to address how learning is supposed to work according to learning theory. Now, in my own approach, we're building a new version of our OpenCog engine, which combines logical reasoning, evolutionary learning, concept blending, various other heuristics on a distributed knowledge metagraph. But you can link large language models into this in a somewhat straightforward way. I mean, you can translate the knowledge in a large language model into a predicate logic format, import it into OpenCog's knowledge base, reason on it, use the results from OpenCog's reasoning, express them in natural language, use that to fine-tune and retrain the large language model. So I think the probability of incrementally tweaking GPT-type models and adding more stuff onto them to get to AGI, that's there, but I see a lot more promise in building more serious cognitive architectures that have LLMs as a component. What I would say, though, is in terms of thinking about either existential risk or shorter term risk of disruptions to society, the properties of a GPT-4 type system may be very different than the properties of a system that incorporates an LLM as a component. So, for example, if you incorporate an LLM within an OpenCog type system, well, OpenCog at its top level is a probabilistic logic reasoner, right? So it's reflective. It knows what its goals are at any given time, and it's just, I wouldn't say it's deterministic, but by any means, but it's proceeding on a much deeper level of self-understanding and transparency than a GPT.
That's really
system,
well explained.
right? So I mean, just
go ahead.
so
Mark.
even if these are on the path to AGI, it doesn't mean that looking at these things from a social.
Go ahead, Mark. Do you?
Okay. Okay. I agree that the GPT architectures seem quite a ways from AGI, that they're not, that they're very impressive. They're holding them back, holds back the contribution they can make to the aggregate intelligence of civilization and the increase of wealth. Max mentioned, aging. There's tremendous things that this capacity that's already been engineered, once deployed, can contribute to society without getting close to AGI. The issue about how close we are to AGI is that there's more scientific discovery that we need. We don't know what it is that's missing. We know that our current AI architectures are not there, but we don't know what's missing. We haven't made the scientific discoveries, and trying to predict when AGI is going to emerge is trying to predict when we're going to make discoveries that we haven't yet discovered. And I
Or
think
maybe
that
the discoveries have been made and you're just not aware of them.
Yeah, I was just going to say exactly the same.
Go ahead, Peter. Yes, Peter, go ahead.
When people say we don't understand intelligence or consciousness, or we need to make breakthroughs, I tend to say glibly, speak for yourself. I think there are some people who believe we have the right architecture. It's just, if you don't have the trillions of dollars that have been plowed into statistical systems, it may be not surprising that we haven't been able to actually, demonstrate practical, large-scale practical systems. I would like to sort of, just respond a little bit to what Ben said. I think we seem to be in agreement that GPT is not likely to be a path to AGI, the architecture. I think all three of us seem to be on the same page. But Ben and I both have cognitive architectures that we've been working on for 20 odd years. Ours is, has been commercialized for more than 15 years. So I do believe we have a direct path to AGI. The difference that ChatGPT has made, I think, in a lot of people's mind, and in mine, I mean, I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked of how much you can achieve with purely dumb statistical systems. I think probably pretty much everybody was shocked by how much you can achieve. What that indicated to me is what I mentioned earlier, is this kind of hardware overhang, that it demonstrates of just how much you can actually achieve with the current hardware that we have. And that's even without massive optimization of the hardware. So in my own estimate, it's just, I mean, I believe we could achieve AGI within a few years if the right effort was put in. And what GPT has demonstrated to me is, or emphasized, that we probably have enough hardware as well for human level intelligence.
Okay, let's move right into, and we're just a minute, we have a minute more, but I think this can be a larger conversation. The next section of this, since we've pretty much diminished the fact that AGI, that GPT-4 is not going to be the AGI in its current structure or architecture. That, as Ben says, it's need all these other ingredients and structures and add-ons and reconfigurations and markets.
But yeah, Sam Altman knows that, right? And the folks at OpenAI, very many of them know that. And the folks at Microsoft, which has a much larger and in many ways more knowledgeable team than OpenAI, know that. And they're working right now on integrating Microsoft Knowledge Graph and various reasoning algorithms working there into successor versions of GPT-4, right? So while I think I have a better approach than they do, I would say, all of a sudden everyone likes neural symbolic methods, whereas they didn't last year, because it seems like the most straightforward method to incorporate reasoning and respect for truth into the AI architecture. So I would say it's sort of a straw man to say that people think just making GPT-4 bigger will lead to AGI, because that's not actually what OpenAI or Anthropic are doing,
Right.
let alone what Peter and I are doing.
Yes, exactly. And then you look at some of the criticisms, those concerns about GPT-4, hallucinations. That's kind of anthropomorphizing the GPT-4, but the hallucinations are, in other words, fake news or misrepresentations, but we see that so much around us anyway. Yes, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think hallucinations is not the best term. I mean, obviously, any term is
I
a
agree.
metaphor. Metaphors are hazardous. But I think the best term is bullshit as the philosophers have defined it. There's a philosopher that's given sort of a technical meaning to bullshit as distinct from lies. A lie is said being aware of what's true and trying to lead people away from the truth. Bullshit doesn't care what's true. It's just spouting things that sound plausible.
But yeah.
And GPT is astonishing. I would say it's already superhuman at its ability to spin plausible sounding bullshit.
Go ahead.
No,
Rob.
I can do better. I think
Oh.
I can beat GPT for it. I don't think it's superhuman.
Okay, Robin, did you have a comment you want to make? Or are you just high-fiving?
No,
Mark?
I did. So the question here is framed as which thing will lead to AGI, but I actually think the more fundamental question is there a level or threshold effect at AGI? That is, as systems improve and they come to or past this AGI level, whatever that means, should we expect a discontinuity at that point or not? Or how much of one or what type? That's the more interesting question. If they're not going to be a discontinuity there, then it's not that important. Exactly.
I think the discontinuity will be broadly acknowledged only in hindsight. And while it's actually happening, people will just argue about it. So,
okay, let's go to the next topic here. Topic number 3, plausibility, AI-Foom versus soft takeoff. This kind of leads into it. We've been romancing this a little bit with that, but go ahead. Peter, you start, then Mark, then Ben, and then everyone else jump in.
Okay. Well, yeah, Robert, just what you said. I'm surprised that people don't, that people have disagreement over what will happen when you reach human level general intelligence. When you reach human level general intelligence, you will have programmers that are smarter than human programmers. They'll be able to concentrate better. They'll have access to more information. They'll be able to replay. We'll have photographic memory. They'll have instant access to, source code. In many ways, of course, we already know that with current limited AIs, that they have many advantages over human intelligence. So once you have human level general intelligence, the way we think, reason, our metacognition, our concept formation, and so on, it absolutely stands to reason that in my mind, that there will be a massive acceleration in improving these AIs, improving themselves. When I say themselves, I don't necessarily mean that they'll be self-motivated to do that, but basically, we will say, hey, can you improve this code? Can you, and yes, I can improve the code. Okay, now you even smarter. So to me, it's very obvious that when we have seed AI, that AI will very rapidly improve. Now, it's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be in somebody's dark basement. It doesn't imply that the AI will take over the world and, build robots overnight and do nanotechnology. I mean, there's an incredible amount of friction in the real world to actually get stuff done. But in terms of pure cognitive intelligence, there's no doubt in my mind that when you reach a certain level, that will then improve very, very rapidly to whatever level, whatever limit hardware imposes, and whatever limit intelligence itself has, because intelligence itself is not infinite, cannot be infinite. We know that almost everything in the world is chaotic, and it doesn't matter how much intelligence you throw at it. There are, most problems in the real world are actually not tractable. I call that the firm takeoff, not the overnight basement take over the world scenario. That's impossible, but I also don't see it something dragging on for decades.
Can we make a distinction
want to
Peter, between a technically fast or firm takeoff versus the effects on the actual world? Because as you're probably very familiar, we've had for several decades things like enterprise resource management software and all these sales automation stuff. But it took a long time for people to actually put that into practice and rejigger their corporations. So we might have some incredible capabilities in these devices. It wouldn't necessarily mean that it's going to change society right away, because it will depend on how we deploy them, which is going to require humans and human institutions. Would you agree with that?
Okay,
I'd love to talk about that, but it's kind of a bit of a separate topic, an important one.
Go ahead, Mark. Yes.
Yeah, that's what Max said is a perfect segue for a lot of the points that I want to make. We've already been living with superintelligences as in human institutions. Human institutions composed of many humans are non-human superintelligences. And for much of our history, they've been very badly misaligned with human good. And through various inventions, we've learned to better align the activity of these superintelligences with benefit to humans. Today, the superintelligence of these institutions emerges both from human and machine intelligences. As machines get more and more capable, whether you call that intelligence or you just call it an aid to intelligence, as machines contribute more and more, they contribute more and more to the aggregate intelligence of these human institutions. And that's accelerating. And the main thing is it's very easy to imagine some of these hard takeoff unipolar things. I think it's important to imagine concretely the soft multipolar scenarios that we hope for instead. And that's very much an extension of the growth of civilization that we're already seeing, of the multipolar growth of human institutions within a cooperative, voluntary fabric of interacting with each other in law-like ways, in ways constrained by the rule of law, constrained by voluntary interactions with each other, each of which are self-interested, but the overall fabric of voluntary interaction leads them to cooperate with each other. I think I'm going to bring in crypto here as an important element, which is these intelligences are not inherently jurisdictional. Most of our interactions with each other are already not inherently jurisdictional. For most of you on this call, I have no idea where in the world you are, and I don't care. So systems of law for creating a fabric of cooperation that are rooted in geographic jurisdictions are not the foundation for the peaceful cooperation of these increasingly machine-dominated institutions making up civilization. We need smart contracts running on blockchain, running on modern crypto, running over the net, can provide a law-like fabric for interaction that is non-jurisdictional and native to the nature of the interaction that these things engage in.
Ben, do you want to make a comment?
On AI-Foom, I mean, I think I agree with Peter's take on that in almost every regard. So I won't repeat that, but just say, yeah, you got it. We've discussed this many times. I can add a few more remarks onto that. I mean, I think, yes, it'll be a soft takeoff followed by a hard takeoff, right? I mean, there's going to be a period of time. There certainly will be a moment where it's clear to me, and probably clear to every AI expert who doesn't have a really strong emotional bias in some demented direction. I mean, there will be a moment where it's clear to the majority of AI experts that you've got a system that really is human-like AGI and is is able to self-understand, understand others, create, imagine, and so forth. And you'll see like it's just doing the thing without all these weird arguments and hand waving. And I think from that point to having a full scale human level AGI that's as capable as, say, me or Robin or Peter or Natasha and so forth, from that, it's not going to be 1 minute. It could be 6 months. It could be 3 or 4 years. But it's. I mean, you're talking about from when you make the breakthrough to having your AGI cognitive architecture really work, whether it's OpenCog, Peter's thing, or GPT-7, whatever, right? From that point where you truly see the sparks of AGI and not the bogus sparks of AGI that are being reported now. I mean, I think that may be years, but it's not, probably not even years, but because once you get to that point, there's going to be truly insane amounts of resources pouring into making similar things happen from all sorts of directions. And then, you know, once you get to the point of an AGI that is, you know, as smart as a human computer scientist or AI researcher, yes, I agree with Peter. The only thing that would stop a rapid explosion to superintelligence is if that AGI itself decided it was too dangerous for some reason, right? Because I mean, at that point, you have a system which can rewrite its own source code. It can design new hardware, can design new robotized factories, and indeed, there's plumbing to be done. I mean, if you design a new chip, the AGI still has to deal with refitting a factory to build that new chip and so forth. It's not happening in 5 seconds. On the other hand, if you have a system whose software is running across 1 million different servers around the globe, and it figures out a way to refactor its software, could it quintuple its intelligence in a day? Quite possibly, if it's a software modification, right? That doesn't have to take a super long time. So I think all that is perfectly plausible, and I think there are existential risks here which you can't fully eliminate. And actually, if the Eliezers of the world, and there's only one Eliezer in the world, but if the allies of Mr. Yudkowsky were to say, like, we really must have a very wide confidence interval, and we can't say with certainty what's going to happen when we have a machine 10 times smarter than us, that's a somewhat hard thing to rationally argue against. I mean, I have my own intuition and feeling, but rationally, we are stepping into a wild and unknown domain. It's when people say, well, if an AGI is smarter than us and we haven't done this or this specific thing, it's almost certain to do something bad. That seems entirely irrational and just founded in emotion and fear. I don't see how that level of certainty can come about. But coming back briefly to a point that was raised about centralization, I do think that this transitional period, like in between getting a true spark of AGI where most experts can see, like, this thing is really thinking like people, in between that point and the point where the system can go foom, right? Which could be 6 months, or it could be 2 years, it could be whatever period of time. I don't think it's 20 years. A lot of amazing or unpleasant things could happen on the planet, right? And if you could have a super intense early stage AGI arms race. I mean, you could have a government try to, take control physically of everyone who knows how to build this thing because they see it as the biggest national security threat in the world and so forth. And here is where I think having a open source and very broadly decentralized infrastructure for the emerging AGI could make outcomes very different. And of course, there are risks there, because if you have an emerging AGI that's owned and controlled by 10 people, and there's super ethical 10 people who are super brilliant 10 people, then maybe in theory that's the optimal way to do it. That's usually failed badly in human history, and I have more faith, though not absolute faith, in a sort of open, broadly distributed approach to get through that critical
Yes,
phase.
Ben, and thank you for
I'm-
bringing it back to what Mark's point is, and I think we can conclude on that. Mark, did you want to make a final comment before we go to the topic 4?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
We keep talking about the AGI as if it is a thing, as if it is a system running on a single computer, being run by a single administrative domain, a single institution. There's nothing necessary about that. The
Well,
system.
I certainly wasn't. I certainly wasn't doing that.
Sorry,
I mean,
hold
my whole
on,
Singularity
hold on.
Net project is the other way, right?
Can I please? I want to complete the point, and then you can respond to the entire point.
Okay, sure, but it's a false point.
Okay.
So complete it if you want. Yeah.
The thing that has this capacity is a multipolar ecosystem of many intelligent subsystems contributing to the overall intelligence of the aggregate, but it's an ecosystem spread across many institutions in which the pieces are being run by different institutions to serve different purposes and cooperating with each other. Then you can prevent there being a concentration of power. And the key thing is the multipolar development maximizes the probability that the thing that is super intelligent that emerges is the system consisting of this ecosystem.
Thank you, Mark. Well, let's go to the last. The 4th point is the practicality of the AI pause. And I'd like to start with Anders, then Max, then Robin, and I'd like all of you to comment on this. What is the practicality of it? Why? And what good is it going to do? And you can even say some of the downsides of having this pause. So Anders, why don't you start?
I'm one of the people who signed that letter from FLI, and quite a lot of people have misconstrued what it actually was, because this being the internet era, of course, nobody ever reads the actual content. Everybody just reads the headline. And the idea is try to make a pause about training bigger general models like GPT-5. But that doesn't mean stop the AI research. There are various reasons listed in this letter, mostly coming from near, mid, and long-term considerations about risk. But I think one way of understanding that idea is to note that every time we get a new GPT version, we spend several weeks or months discovering totally unexpected capabilities and building applications and getting shocked by things like the Luigi effect and other completely different things that are a bit disconcerting from a safety standpoint. We might want to have a better way of handling that before we get the next shower of things from the next big model. Now, the problem is, of course, it's nice to do that letter, but let's be realistic. I don't think we should expect any 6 months hiatus. But that was actually, I don't think that was the point of the letter. It's an expression of concern. It's a little bit like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists doomsday clock. Although it's totally failing us, giving us information about how risky the world is, it's kind of making an annual statement that this is the state of the world and this is what we're worried about. It actually did succeed quite well in getting a big, broad, complicated, messy discourse going. And from that, I think is good. On the other hand, could we actually stop the AI development if we really wanted to? If there was everybody in the world more or less agreed that, yeah, AGI is a bad thing, then it's very likely that one could probably slow it down, because a minority wanting to have AGI still needs to get some compute and actually have a lot of interactions in order to make progress. If most sensible researchers didn't want to be part of that, then it wouldn't happen. We've seen that to some extent in other fields. But in practice, we want AI. As we're probably going to discuss in the last part, there are good reasons to want to have AI. There are good reasons to even want AGI. But that means that instead you want to shape where it's going. And I think that is the interesting discussion we should be trying to have here in the panel. Where can we shape this usefully, actually, given the world we got and the companies we got and the economics we got and so on?
Good point. I remember a conference, Shaping the Future. So Max, let's go to you and then Robin. Just a couple points here. I think probably some of the misconception about the open letter is that it was produced by the Future of Life Institute, which is highly aligned with existential risk. So it's already been sequestered to that emotional stance there. Yeah,
I'm not buying that, but then again, I'm at the Future Humanity Institute, which is about as doomy or even doomier than FLI. So
right.
maybe.
Yeah, and you're someone who always looks at all sides of the issues, and that is unique, and we need that so very much, Anders. So Max, pause or not, and as Anders said, let's get deeper into this discussion. How can we steer or shape this AI to be worthy?
Yeah, so Anders actually did read the pause statement. I haven't read the European version, which I understand is quite different. I need to take a look at that one. It sounded at least a little bit more able to go ahead with things and shape them a bit more. But yeah, I'm sure a lot of people don't actually read it. My view on this is to sort of go behind the intentions as to what we think regulation should do and ask what it will actually do. So one issue I have is that, I don't think this pause is going to happen anyway, but let's say it could actually get, it's being discussed in Congress right now. And, idiot politicians are going to propose something. And it's not going to be what anybody wants, probably. And the problem is, as we've seen, in lots of recent examples, 6 months will become something longer, right? It was, 15 days to slow the spread. This temporary student loans, which, weren't so temporary. The nuclear regulations we mentioned earlier, which has killed nuclear power for decades now. So my concern is that although 6-month pause on certain things, as Anders pointed out, it's not a pause on everything, on all kinds of research. It's likely in political terms to turn into something else. I'm just dreading the likelihood that we're going to have an agency like the CDC or the FDA, Federal Bureau of Artificial Intelligence. Oh my God. What is that going to do? It's going to distort everything. It's going to slow things down. It should be fast. It's going to speed up things that are bad. It has its own institutional pressures. All you guys understand this, but most people don't, right? Once an agency has power, it wants more power. It's going to extend its control. That's why I'm extremely nervous about any kind of, a voluntary pause is one thing, but again, it may inspire something stronger and more coercive. And I think that's going to be a big issue. And the other side of it, that really to me is, I'm seeing very little discussion in most parties about the costs of delay. We see the upside, we see the supposed benefits that it's not going to kill us too soon and reduce some of these short-term problems. But I keep coming back to the fact I'm in my 60th year and I'm going to die soon, and you're going to die, and you're going to die unless we do something about this aging problem. So talk about existential risk. We're all facing this existential risk right now. This gets complicated because I think a lot of the people discussing this, at least until recently, have been from a utilitarian perspective. And now we're seeing that kind of explicitly built into the long-termism stuff. So we're suddenly not very important because there's a vast future ahead of us of non-existent possible people, and we have to take their interests into account, and ours become trivial by comparison. I have real issues with that kind of whole approach because I'm not a utilitarian. But it tends to make people not talk about the fact that we're going to die unless we do something. We've got people starving in other countries because they're not very productive, and we could help them out. We could solve a lot of medical problems in the third world. There's all kinds of benefits, and I don't see much accounting. I can understand from the people like Eliezer who are sure it's going to kill us. They're just going to dismiss those. But people with a more moderate position, I think we should appreciate the benefits of allowing it to continue in reasonable ways.
Robin, please go ahead.
I am a professor of economics. I got my PhD doing formal political theory at Caltech, so I can speak with some authority when I say our governance systems just aren't that good. They aren't that capable. They have limited abilities of what they can do, and that's just important to realize. So our standard models of politics and our data politics say most voters want politicians who share their positions, and they want to express a position and see it echoed in their politicians, even when those politicians have nothing to do with that policy. The world of policy is somewhat separate from the world of political expressions. And in the world of policy, when people have empowered regulatory agencies on the basis of some sort of vague theme of an emotion that people have, that just doesn't tend to work out very well. Regulation works out better when you have a relatively concrete problem that you can see in concrete form. You can authorize a particular approach to that problem, and then the agencies follow that approach and fix the problem that way. If you want highways built, you know what highways look like. You say, hey, you guys build highways, then they can go build highways, and at the end, you'll have highways. Whereas if you just vaguely say, like, solve inequality or solve justice or something, that just doesn't work out very well. So that's the thing to be wary of here, is we're just really in the early days of having much of an idea of what any concrete problems will look like. I'm not really at all scared by ChatGPT, even as a current firm. I don't see it doing anything substantially harm to people that would at all call for regulation compared to our usual standards for other kinds of regulation. I might say, any kind of text you put out in the world, you should be responsible for. And if it comes from your machine, then you're responsible in that way. But I don't see why we should hold text that comes out of these machines anymore by any different standard than anything else. I think eventually we will see more concrete systems with more concrete problems, and then we should focus on coming up with concrete solutions to solve those concrete problems. And yes, regulation may well be a part of that, but for God's sake, wait till you see something that government could do something about. Just sort of vague concerns are just not the sort of thing government's very good at.
Anders, let me go to you.
Yeah, so I think one interesting issue is, okay, what concrete can we do that would actually be useful? And one obvious part would be safety standards, or just ways of measuring safety. So GPT-4 had a really interesting paper added to it, where the RSC actually did various safety testing and found how they could make the model do things that are bad in various ways. One can quibble a lot about what you believe about the badness of these ones, but some of them were kind of concerning, like it could come up with the idea of lying to people on Mechanical Turk in order to look like a human, in order to get certain resources done. That's kind of not what you want probably in your software. So I think many of us on this panel might think it's totally fine to use it to try to generate knockoff drugs with life extension properties and then source them from China. Yet I think we can see some risks from that. That is, of course, near-term stuff, but developing good practices for how to actually test these models and tell what behaviors they can and cannot do, and what trade-offs we're willing to do, seems to be useful. And right now, that's not done very widely. So this is where we might want to actually establish industry standards, best practices, and maybe even use this moment to get everybody in on, yeah, at least we're going to run these evaluations of the models to test, to see what we can, what we cannot do, and where we're reliable and unreliable. That seems to be super useful, doesn't necessarily require enormous regulations. You could imagine industry organizations doing it, and it would be useful. A final small point about the long-termist and the consequentialist. You can totally be a deontologist and care a lot about the future too. Samuel Scheffer, for example, has a good argument for why we should want to avoid existential risk, which is totally deontological. And you basically end up behaving as if you were a consequentialist, long-termist, even though it's based on very intuitive deontology. The real issue is, what trade-offs? Can we make them explicit? The nice thing about consequentialism is that it's willing to talk about trade-offs. Quite often, other moral stances like deontology don't really like to say that there are trade-offs. But in reality, in politics, in economic, in business, in programming and engineering, we all have to do trade-offs, and we need to be open about which ones we're making.
Yes, I agree.
I just say, Anders, that I'm not a deontologist either. I'm more of a virtue ethics kind of guy, which just does have that trade-off.
The virtue ethics case is much more interesting.
Yeah. Just to comment on something that Robin was saying, you may get the impression, I think, that no regulation would work, although in my blog piece I did give some examples. I think it's a good point that if you make it very narrow, let's say, the issue is people dying in car crashes and the regulators want to have airbags, that's a very specific concrete thing, and that can work in the sense of accelerating the adoption, making people adopt it. It may have costs and so on we can argue about, but it's something that's much more workable. And as you say, enforcing regulating for justice is just not going to work, and AI seems a lot more like justice than this. So I like Anders' suggestion of focusing more on industry protocol and safety standards, which again doesn't really have to be done by governments. One thing I like to raise, if people want to, if you have any time for it, we probably don't, is the issue of transparency. And is transparency good or bad, and what kind of transparency? Because on the one hand, you can argue, one I think quite reasonable argument is if we slow things down too much or stop things, people like China and Russia might go ahead. And then people say, well, but if you stop it all, they can't go ahead. But well, that depends on how transparent our systems are. If people think transparency is a good thing, but I think that allows bad actors to copy your code. Maybe it's not such a good thing. So, what is the optimal level of transparency? What type of transparency? I think would be an interesting discussion too. Maybe it's too much for the day. I don't know.
Well, we could have a second part. But what I'd like to do in the last couple of minutes is to just go around and have everyone give their particular view or understanding, or even a theoretical approach or practice-based approach on the practicality of this pause. And as Anders was suggesting, let's look at some ramifications of what we can do to make it more industry safe. What are the standards? What questions should we be asking rather than, put a finger on the pause? So Robin, let's start with you and then go to Peter, then back to Max, Anders, Mark, and close with Ben. Okay, Robin, please. Robin's froze again, so this is funny. Okay, Peter.
Right. Okay. Just one quick point that I want to expand on what Max was saying, to evaluate not just the potential benefit, but also the cost of a pause. And I've long believed that there's a real risk of, or that we need AI to save ourselves from ourselves. That if you look at a lot of trends in society, that society is becoming that complex, especially when you look at politics, that maybe civilization is going to hit a wall, and maybe we need more intelligence. Maybe we need AI to help us manage our lives. So I think that is a real cost, saying, yes, there's first of all life extension, but there's also just the general thing we may be, society, civilization may actually be just screwing up badly, and that we need to bring more intelligence to it. So I think we need to just go ahead. In terms of the practicality of being more careful and having standards in AI, I mean, who's going to dictate those standards? It's going to be very self-interested on whoever actually has enough clout to come up with standards. So I don't see that as being practically very good. I prefer Robin's suggestion is to make companies liable for what they're putting out there, which is really not happening right now.
Thank you, Peter. Robin, you were frozen, so this is kind of leads into you.
So it seems to me we're going to know almost nothing more in 6 months than we know now. The major thing that would happen between now.
Froze again. We'll come back to Robin. Let's go to Anders, since you're enjoying. You're having a good. Okay.
Hey, Natasha, I've got to go. Actually,
Okay, so Ben, go ahead.
Seconds.
Robin, hold on. We're going to go to Ben because he has to leave. I gotta go back to you.
I've got to catch a ferry off the island where I live. Yes, so I'm in. Yeah, standards, if done well, would be a good thing, and I think it's a worthwhile pursuit, if only because of the conversations that will happen in an attempt to agree on them, which will get people from competing companies in different countries together to discuss relevant things. So I mean, I think that's good. Certainly standards underlying the operation of the internet have been helpful on the technical level, right? So I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to various participants in the ecosystem meeting together, discussing, trying to come up with various standards to follow in various regards. I have a suspicion that the pace of converging on such meaningful standards will be so much slower than the pace of evolution of the technology, that ultimately the putting in place of these standards is probably not going to be that decisive a factor in the unfolding of the technology. So let's say if Ray Kurzweil's estimate was basically right, that we get human level AGI by 2029. So setting aside his silly idea of a 16-year gap between there and the singularity. So just suppose he's right about 2029. I think things are going to be revolutionized then multiple times between now and 2029 in such a way that attempts to put standards in place are going to be playing a pathetic game of catch up. But it's still worth trying. I hope that's wrong and some useful standards can be put in place. And I think the conversations involved in trying to make such standards will probably be helpful. I mean, of course, the pause isn't going to happen. That was always obvious, and for the reasons that people have already said, like no revolutionary insight on how to integrate AI into society is going to be come up with in 6 months, right? I mean, there's no magic answer you're going to arrive at by meeting and pontificating for 6 months. And of course, you know, if there really were a public agreement to stop developing big language models or other kinds of AGIs, all that would mean is that big companies would do it secretly, using it to enhance their products and not release it to the end user. Meanwhile, Putin and Xi Jinping also do it secretly. I mean, it's not a plausible thing in the first place. And one advantage of seeking for standards is, while very difficult and also not likely to happen, at least it's not going to lead to all sorts of nasty taking black of things and make things secret and back channel and worse, right? So I see very little downside to pursuing standards and more upside, whereas a pause is not going to happen, and if it was going to happen, would probably have more bad than good effects. I mean, even given that GPT-4 is not an AGI and is only going to be a component of an AGI architecture, that a pause would still probably have all sorts of bad ancillary effects.
All prohibitions do, don't they? Let's go back to Robin. You froze. You're right in the middle of a sentence. So can you recall what you were saying?
I'm not sure when you guys stop, but apparently when Natasha calls my name, my connection dies. That's the way it goes.
Okay.
I'll just make the comment that with the early days of the internet and social media, many people in government wanted to regulate and they wanted to control these things because these things seem dangerous. And the major argument on the other side was this stuff is changing too fast. If you regulate it, you'll freeze it in and you'll miss all the future opportunity. I think that applies here. AI is at the moment just changing too fast for us to have much of a good idea how to. I don't mind people sharing, technical information and their approaches to do it, but I think it's too early.
Thank you, Robin. Let's go to Anders.
So another approach some people have been talking about is maybe we could have a Manhattan Project for AI safety. And that might be great fun if you're invited and get the research funding to do it. But it's obviously not a workable thing. The Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project were vast projects that knew fairly well what they wanted to achieve and roughly the relevant physics. And then there was just a lot of hard engineering problems to solve on the way. The problem here is, of course, safety is not well defined. That is probably why you need a lot of different approaches. Now, if you think that if we get it wrong, we're all dead, the kind of Eliezer position, then you need to be super careful and we need to work very hard. If you, like me, think there is a lot of risk here, but there's also a lot of opportunities and many risks can be solved, then you can use a Swiss cheese model of safeguards. You have a piece of Swiss cheese with holes in it. It stops some of the impinging problems, but some of them go through. But if you have another piece of cheese behind that one, you reduce it, the risk of something getting through. This is standard in how you do a lot of secure systems. Sometimes you can do that finely tuned, perfect thing, and that might be worth doing for some very important things. But in quite a lot of domains, you can actually use a thick piece of Swiss cheese instead. Now, Eliezer doesn't like that, but I think this is a more plausible one. And it's also, from a business standpoint, more reasonable. Making a law-abiding car or a robot, oh, I can sell that much better than my competitor who can't claim that his car will obey the law. Getting something that actually can understand arbitrary human rules, even if they're silly, that's valuable and might help with alignment. So I do think that there is a lot of opportunities here to do it. Who is going to set these standards? And I think we actually have a chance of doing things surprisingly fast. Things are moving fast also in the self-regulation. People are starting organizations, starting test cases. I think in 6 months, we could actually probably set quite a lot of standards if we put our mind to it. It doesn't have to be the entire world. And probably Washington and especially Brussels are going to be moving way too slowly. They're going to make a rule that is going to be applying to GPT-4 by the time GPT-8 is running the show.
Right. Thank you, Anders. Okay, Mark, let's go to you and close out with Max's final comments.
I think that people are generally underestimating the safety that emerges from not having any controls, not trying to be safe, just everybody rushing ahead to build systems in our current position of ignorance, where they're trying out different architectures, deploying these for different purposes within organizations, each of which is embedded in a civilization in which each organization finds itself in a world mostly populated by the other organizations, and therefore needing to cooperate with them to pursue its own ends. By not having any control, by just proceeding, you proceed in as diverse a way as possible. You proceed with lots of different experiments, discovering different things, where you maximize the chance, once again, of the emergent intelligence being the ecosystem among all of these different architectures running by all of these different organizations. And I think any proposal for control should be held up against the emergent safety of an uncontrolled scenario, and generally will be found to decrease safety rather than increase it.
Symbiosis. Yeah, seeing how the relationship, that's how life started, didn't it? In a cesspool of a bacterium coming together and evolving. So it's very interesting when we think about the very beginning of life and the chemistry of it to the very beginning of this, and some of the machinery, the technology of it. Thank you, Mark. Max, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, really just to agree with some things that have already been said. I think rather than having a centralized regulation, which is incredibly slow to adapt and causes so many problems, having a more general system like liability can work, because that can get screwed up when you have trial lawyers controlling Congress and having too many lawsuits. But still, having liability means you decentralize the enforcement of good rules, right? So if an autonomous driving company is liable, they're going to have a lot of incentive to root out the problems with their cars. So I think that's a better method, a more distributed method of sort of market regulation. But my main point, because I don't want to repeat what I've already said, the main point I want to make, which I try to put into the proactionary principle, which contrary to LAIs, it doesn't mean you ignore big downsides. You just you have to take those into account when you're looking at the probabilities. But one thing it does emphasize is the idea that you cannot really, and somebody's already made this point, you can't really learn anything until you do something. It's kind of a very Cartesian view or a Platonic view that you can sit there in your chair and think about all the AI safety problems and produce solutions while we're not actually doing anything, because that's not really the way the world works. You've got to let people do things, trial things, and figure out things as they go along. So I think Mark is making a sort of a similar point there. We can't just sit there and imagine all the problems and sensible safety approaches. We really have to, you look before leaping, but you also look while leaping. So that's it, really.
Thank you so much. Were there any questions in the chat that any of you would like to address, just to be respectful of all the attendees? I don't know if anyone's had a chance.
There's a lot in the chat, so
I know there's a lot. I haven't even, I'm trying to make sure that I'm listening intently to each aspect of what you're saying. And
I think there's one of the things that was remarked on, and that is probably worth emphasizing, is the point that Mark made, is by not regulating things, we gain more experience and have more people try different things, and we're more likely to get an early warning of where we might pay extra attention to it. On the other hand, though, I think there are 2 points that stuck out to me that might be worth having a follow-up discussion on. And the one is, we didn't really talk about alignment, which is kind of the big reason why we're even having this discussion. I mean, that's ultimately the existential risk is supposed to be the alignment problem. And the other thing that there seems to be some disagreement over is whether intelligence is inherently sort of embedded in an organization, and that companies are actually intelligent, which I actually strongly disagree with. I believe an AGI will be a singular, highly integrated system to have human level intelligence. I'm not saying there will only be one in the world, but I don't believe that you can have human level intelligence or AGI in a distributed system, which, there's obviously some major disagreement on that point.
Thank you, Peter. We can have a follow-up session, and I'd like to also include Susan Schneider and Nell Watson and a few other people who have distinct views. It seems like the consensus was that more open and let it roll and see what happens, and then we will discover the problems rather than over controlling in the first place. And I know, while you said that wasn't the purpose of the open letter, so how would you address the final comments in that regard?
I think the wonderful thing about the letter was many of the people signing it have mentioned that they don't agree with various chunks of the letter. In fact, very few people talking about the letter seem to be agreeing on 100% of it. It's more of a symbolic action. Yeah. Symbolic actions can sometimes be very empty, but in this case, I think it actually has a bit of heft. It does demonstrate that there are serious concerns coming from people who are both inside the AI field and in the various kind of auxiliary fields commenting on AI, discussing it, and are actually saying, look, society needs to be involved there. As we have discussed, maybe it's going to have counterproductive effects. But I think that awareness that something is actually going on here, that AI is going to be a very important question, that is quite central. And I think it's also kind of useful to have that as a starting point. I would be surprised if the consequences down the line are anything we can predict, but we can push in sensible directions. We can make good arguments, and I think that is the best we can do.
I'd like to follow up with just a couple of closing comments of my own. The internet was mentioned when we had the World Wide Web, and then it started exploding. There was a concern about taxation and regulation, looking at encryption of our privacy and identity. A lot of these issues were important. And John Perry Barlow and a few others started the Electronic Frontier Foundation to protect the rights of people on the web. That is really important. And that organization still exists today. It was founded, in 1991, somewhere around there. Still a very important organization. Now we've become the Internet of Things. And some people may say, well, it's not so important anymore because we've gone beyond some of those original issues that we were concerned about. But I see the same thing with AI. I think there needs to be some group of creative thinkers that are assessing our identity, our rights, our human rights, and our agency rights that are not part of the sequestered group. And what my concern is primarily is what we experienced in 2003 going into 2004 with President George W. Bush's Bioethics Committee or Council, and the moratorium that was put on stem cells. And of course, we had the VP Summit where we argued in opposition to that type of moratorium and the the ceasing of it entirely, but the beauty of what came out of that, there was a workaround. Then we learned that we could build stem cells separately outside of the placenta or the embryo or the umbilical cord. So there's always new ideas that come up, and this ties into, I think, what Mark and Peter and Robin and Max were saying primarily, that ideas and creativity needs space to generate without groups of self-appointed let's say machine ethicists determining what is okay and not, rules and regulations on people's freedom to invent and create. So we need to look at all sides of this, and I hope to have you all back next month to look at the alignment problem. As Peter suggested, is intelligence embedded in an organizational structure, or is it individual agency? Thank you very much for being here. I enjoyed it enormously, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Madam Moderator, before you leave, there was a question as to whether the chat would be available afterwards.
I guess I'll send it to the attendees only. Yes. But you should all know we sold out. It's a free event, but we sold out. I had to keep on going, adding more tickets to the register. So I'm so glad so many people are interested in this topic, and I will be editing this video and making it available to you. Thank you again.
Thank you for
See
organizing
everybody.
this.
Thank you.
Thank you.